Now, again, starting here, we will look at this again in Romans this evening. Romans chapter 12, 17 through 21. And Paul is speaking, and he's telling us, again, recompense no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. Now, I'm not going to be getting into these too much because we looked at these heavily this morning. If it be possible, and again, for those of you that weren't here this morning, this is part of what we concentrated on. If it be possible, and as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. In fact, what we looked at this morning is there are some circumstances where this is not able to be done. Paul himself found himself in these places at some times when the enemy was trying to kill him, like today in the place of ISIS. If you lived as a Christian in the middle of ISIS, you're not going to be able to live peaceably among all men. But we need to still look at what God says. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. But rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. The simple truth of the matter, although there are times that you may not be able to live peaceably among all men, and you may have to stand and defend yourself, that is true. But we don't go out of the way seeking vengeance on our own behalf. If it's not a place we have to stand, like I mentioned this morning, and I'll say this again, if your neighbor comes over and flats your tires, and they do it in the middle of the night, and you go, I think my neighbor flattened my tires. You don't sneak back across the street the next night and slash his tires, then his wife's tires, and, well, maybe another neighbor because he, threw his lawn clippings on your yard. We don't seek our own vengeance. Now, people mistake that Christians are supposed to be weak. Well, no, we're not. We are called to be meek. There is a difference. And he says, therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Again, we're not talking about defending ourselves. We're not talking about laying ourselves down on the altar, unless God has called us to do that. What we're talking about is at the same time, we don't act the same way that some fool treats us. We don't behave that way as born-again believers. We leave it up to God to seek vengeance on our behalf, and we treat people with love and kindness, even those people that we just want to reach our little hands around and strangle them. We need to use those hands to meet their needs in love, that they can see the love of Christ through us for God's glory. Now again, we saw what Paul did and how he brought chaos, but yet it was the will of God in that instance, and not that we serve the God of chaos, but he used what God called him to use to bring his life into safety. Now here we're going to look at something quite the opposite. In fact, we're going to see David's men. We're going to see brothers in the faith of Judaism, but yet they're not living like brothers at all. It says here, and it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? Now, if you remember, right now David is living outside of the will of God. And we see here, if you would, a kind of repentance. We see that he is now seeking God's advice, saying, now, Saul has died, and Samuel has also died. And now there is no true king in Israel. But yet we know that God has anointed David king over Israel. Now if you remember, as we continue to go through the first book of Samuel, we saw time and time again that people knew that David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. We know that Saul knew that. We knew that Saul's son knew that. We knew that many of the other people that came across David knew that he was anointed to be the king of Israel. Some mocked him for it, and some realized that soon he would be the next king, and they treated him as such. But I'm afraid that all too often, for fear of losing power, some people will refuse to do the will of God. We don't have to look any further than Washington, D.C., or probably the state capital, or probably even our own local government to see the truth of that. But now finally we see David has repented, and he has sought God, and he asked God, should I go up? And David said, whither shall I go up? And he said, unto Hebron. God said, yes, I want you to go up, go into Hebron. So David went up thither, and his two wives, and also Ahinoam the Jezreelite, and Abigail, Nabal's wife, the Carmelite, and his men that were with him, and did David bring up every man with his household, and they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Now this is kind of to be expected. Now here Judah says, hey, I think that's a great idea. We have our next king in our midst. Now they knew he was already anointed by God, and they anointed him to be king over Judah. Well, it makes sense if you live in a town. Imagine if somebody was running for president here from Palestine, Texas. I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. But I don't know about you, but it would be nice to have a president, for the most part. Now there's some folks in Palestine that I surely wouldn't vote for. Let's imagine that one of us here, one of our local congregation, was going to run for president. Brothers and sisters, they might not win, but I'd vote for Brother Douthit. Why is that? Well, because I know him. Not only do I know him, but I know he's going to do what's right for us. So, of course, they're happy to put David up. They're like, yeah, we want a local hero. We want him to be king. Well, it only makes sense. You want somebody that can relate to your troubles and to your problems, so it makes sense that they would have him and anoint him as king, but I think they also knew the will of God. So they anointed him king over the house of Judah, and they told David, saying that the men of Jabesh Gilead, where they buried Saul, and it says, and David sent messengers unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, and said unto them, Blessed be ye of the Lord, that ye have showed this kindness unto your Lord, even unto Saul, and have buried him. And now the Lord show kindness and truth unto you, and I also will requite you this kindness, because ye have done this thing. He said, I want you to know, we were considered enemies. You followed Saul, and Saul sought my life. He said, but let me tell you something. I loved, and he did. He loved Saul despite his many mistakes. And his heart was broken when he heard that he died, especially Saul's son, who he loved dearly as a brother. And he thanked them for what they did and for the kindness that he showed to Saul. And he said, I will show you that same kind of kindness. They risked their lives to bury his body. He said, I will risk my life for you as well. He said, I will repay you with the same kind of kindness. Now let me tell you, to have that kind of a promise from a king is a great thing to have. And as a matter of fact, I dare say that probably everyone that received that letter, at least most of them, if not all, knew that David was the next anointed king by God to rule over all of Israel. But see, here's the thing. Samuel, the one that anointed him, has now died. And then King Saul has died. Well, when you have no spiritual leader and you have no worldly leader, sometimes you find yourself in a vacuum, and people will sometimes seek to steal the power that God has not given. It says, it goes on in verse 7. He says, Therefore now let your hands be strengthened, and be ye valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah have anointed me king over them. Now, he's in a roundabout way of saying something. They know that he is the next anointed king, and Judah has done the right thing and anointed him as king. They should also do the same thing and follow God. They should call him and say, No, you're not king of Judah, you are king of Israel, because God has said so. We know that you were anointed. Even King Saul admitted that David would be the next king over Israel in front of all of his men. Do you remember when he came out? He said right in front of them all, Truly it's true that the kingdom is going to be ripped out of my hand and be put into yours, David. And he asked David to be merciful to his family when this happened. Even Saul's leaders knew that David was supposed to be the next king in Israel. But let's see what happened. In verse 8 it says, But Abner, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, and over all of Israel. Now let me tell you, he was present there, we know. He was the one that was supposed to be watching over the king when David snuck in, and he was there when the king said truly that David would be the next king over Israel. But what would that mean to Abner? Well, with the king gone, and if Abner goes and establishes another king, well, guess what? That king is going to be nothing more than a puppet head, at least in Abner's imagination, and Abner will have the power and control over the nation of Israel. So he brought them all around and made this new man the king over Israel, the one that is not anointed by God. Now keep in mind as we read this, why was it that David never fought against Saul? It wasn't because they weren't enemies, because even though David loved him, they were still enemies. And David wasn't scared to fight. He continuously went and got about and slaughtered the Philistines time and time again that were the enemies of God. So what was it? Do you remember what it was that every time someone tempted him to go against the king of Israel, what did he say? It's not up to me to put my hand against the anointed of God, because he was anointed by God. It was up to God to remove him. But let me tell you, the king that is now established is not anointed by God. David does not owe this man that same kind of mercy. Goes on and says, Ishabeth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and reigned 2 years, but the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king over Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. And Abner, the son of Ner, and of the servants of Ishabeth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servant of David. Now there's a lot of names in here, and I know it gets confusing. Just remember that Joab is with David, and Abner is with Saul. Therefore, Joab is following the true king, and Abner is following the false king. But it said they went out and met together by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down, the one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Now, up until this point, we have no record, and it's not believed that the two have come into any kind of conflict. And now we have two kings trying to rule over one kingdom. Well, with most kings, you now have two kings' armies trying to rule over one kingdom. And let me tell you, it doesn't work that way. We discussed this morning, and we'll discuss now, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And it says, and Abner said to Joab, let the young men now arise and play before us. And Joab said, let them arise. And there arose and went over by number 12 of Benjamin, which pertained to Ishabeth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. Now look at what happens. And they caught every one his fellow by the head, and thrust his sword into his fellow's side. So they fell down together. Wherefore that place is called Hekath-Hizrim, which is in Gibeon. Now imagine this for a minute. Now I'm going to tell you, they say all's fair in love and war, but that is not true. It's not. If all was fair in love and war, then God would have had no reason to write a Bible. He would have just said either be loving or be fighting and call it done. Now here they are, they've met aside, and let me tell you, instead of doing the godly thing, they did the worldly thing. They met together and they did like the pagans do. Now, these are brothers in the faith. These are all sons of Israel. These are brothers. This is family. They should be fighting together. Instead, they're doing as so many families do today, and fighting against each other. And look at what they call play. How many of you remember when David and Goliath went, and Goliath challenged the nation of Israel, and he said, if any can defeat me, well, we'll call the war over, and we'll be done, and we'll go home, which they did kind of rapidly when one poor little shepherd boy could whoop their giant. Well, see, that's what they did. They said, instead of us fighting together in a big war, you send 12, well, I'll send 12, and we'll just kind of have a competition to see who's are the best. And, well, I may be wrong, and it's not recorded this way, but I have some suspicion that God might have played a hand in that, because they all died at the same time. You just don't see that. Everyone grabbed the other one, they stabbed each other, and they all fell down together at one time. And, I don't know, maybe I watched too much TV, but there was no sword clanking going on. They all grabbed each other and just stabbed each other, and it was done. See, God does not make sport out of war. There are times to fight, but it's not a game. They said, let them play together, and yet they sent them to kill brother against brother. Why? It wasn't for the glory of God. It was to prove who was the better. And it only gets worse. And Abner said to Joab, Verse 17 says, and there was a very sore battle that day. Up until this point, there was no war. They could have in time had things come about in a right way that brought honor and glory to God, but instead they chose to go out and meet in battle. There's nothing recorded in either way that says that they were supposed to go to battle. No, they went out there to meet and decided on their own, hey, let's try to settle this. Let's see which one of us is the top dog. Let's see who's the best general. And there was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten and the men of Israel before the servants of David. And I believe God's hand was in that as well. And there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab, and Abishai, and Abishai. And Abishai was as light of foot as a wild roe. Kind of like one of those beautiful bucks running in the woods. You ever tried to chase one of them? Those things are fast. He was light, quick, spry. And it says, Asabel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Now, here's Abner the general, one of the greatest warriors of the time. And he's out there running, and here's this young man who is small frame but fast, chasing after Abner. And he refuses to quit chasing after him. And it says, then Abner looked behind him and said, art thou Asahel? And he answered, I am. And Abner said to him, turn thee aside to the right hand or to the left, and lay thee hold on one of the young men, and take thee his armor. Now, I do like this. This is more than fair in a war. He turns around to him and says, look, you keep chasing me. And I'm sure he was probably giving him a good chase as fast as he is. And he's wearing armor more than likely, but this young man is not. He tells him, look, turn to the left, turn to the right, and grab somebody's armor. You know, if you're going to fight me, let's have a fair fight. Especially because he knew who he was. And he knew this was the brother of the other general. And if you remember, oftentimes in those times, the generals themselves or some of their leaders, the leaders of these tribes or the kings would often be spared even in the midst of the battle. If they were captured, the battle was usually considered over. It says, and take thee his armor, but Asahel would not turn aside from following of him. And Abner said again to Asahel, turn thee aside from following me. Wherefore should I smite thee to the ground? How then should I hold my face to Joab, thy brother? See, it's just not the way it was done. Now, I'm sorry to say, I don't know how they can hold their face before God in the first place, turning what could have been a casual meeting and possibly a peace treaty into a war, into a game of sport. It says in verse 23, howbeit he refused to turn aside. Wherefore Abner, with the hinder end of the spear, smote him under the 5th rib, and the spear came out behind him. And he fell down there and died in the same place. And it came to pass that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died, they stood still. It was one of the leaders unexpected to die. One of the fastest. I'd say probably not one of the brightest. He tried his best to spare his life, but he could not. That's more than fair in war. But it says, Joab and Abishai pursued after Abner, and the sun went down when they were come to the hill of Ammah, that lieth before Giah, by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. And the children of Benjamin gathered themselves together after Abner, and became one troop, and stood on the top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, shall the sword devour forever? Knowest thou not that it will be bitterness in the latter end? How long shall it be that ere thou bid the people return from following their brethren? Now, I think this is funny. Why does it take so long for them to realize what's going on? Why in the first place did they allow their bitter pettiness to erupt from what they considered a cruel game into a violent attack, brother against brother? And then for seeking revenge, they chased them all night long, desiring to kill them all, or at least until Abner or Joab one died. Until finally he said, are you going to chase forever your brother? They'd forgotten all kindness and mercy and turned what could have been peaceful into all-out war. But I do like when you see repentance. And Joab said, as God liveth, unless thou hadst spoken, surely then in the morning the people had gone up every one from following his brother. He said, we would have kept chasing you until you were all dead if you hadn't stopped and spoke. Sometimes the right word at the right time can stop the cruelest of wars. I'm married, I know that's true. For those of you that are married, you know it's true too. Our tongues can be bitter weapons, and they can be the most loving instruments, and sometimes all it takes is a word spoken correctly in the middle of the hottest battle to end the war. So Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and pursued after Israel no more, neither fought they any more. And Abner and his men walked all that night through the plain, and passed over Jordan, and went through all Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. And Joab returned from following Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there lacked of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. But the servants of David had smitten of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. If you want to talk about a sore loss on that battle. And they took up Asahel and buried him in the sepulchre of his father, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at the break of the day. But how did that start? Two generals met on peaceful terms. On opposite sides, there was no need to go any further. But see, neither one of them had the desire to live peaceably among all men. Oh, perhaps David's servant started out that way. But how soon was it that when the enemy challenged, he quickly gave in? See, we may start out with the best intentions in life. We may go to work planning to live peaceably among all men, or to the grocery store, or wherever it is that we find conflict. But how deeply ingrained is that in our heart? Have we truly made up our minds that we will do all that's within us to live peaceably? Or is it when we find the smallest challenge, and I'm a human male and am guilty of this more often than I should, that when we find the smallest challenge, instead of backing up and saying, you know what, this is not my battle, this battle belongs to God, and I refuse to play into the enemy's hand. What did he do? He played into the enemy's hand. Let us go play together. They knew there was no play involved. Compared to the war that was fought and the death and destruction that pursued, it was a small thing. It was 24 men, 12 from each side. Compared to that, well, they could look at that as warriors, as being a small cost. But see, when we look at our sin from a light point of view, saying, oh, it's just a little play amongst our soldiers, so a few die, what's the big deal? When we look at our sin and temptation as a light thing, that's when we find ourselves conquered and swallowed up in it. We need to make sure our heart's in the right place before we leave every day, that we have surrendered ourselves to the will of God, to live peaceably among all men, to love our enemies. Imagine how different it could have been if he said, no, I don't think that would bring honor and glory on God for us to send our men to fight that way. Why don't we sit down together and share a meal? They weren't technically enemies at that time. No battle, no declaration of war had been made. Why don't we sit down together and break bread and worship God and give a sacrifice here and pray to God that we find mercy, that we find grace to live amongst each other. We announce what happened at Mizpah. Imagine the grace that could have followed. Let's close with a word of prayer. Oh, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the blessings in our life. And, oh Lord, as we find the enemy more and more around us, Lord, teach our hearts when it's time to stand, but also teach our hearts when it's time to live peaceably, Lord. Let not our pride, Lord, because that's what usually gets us in trouble. Let our pride not consume us, Lord, but let us remember that you are living in us and that we are to be a reflection of your light, standing when you call us to stand, and Lord, also living peaceably when you've called us to live peaceably. We pray all this in your holy and precious name. Amen.